Good morning, everyone. Harriet's presentation gave us some great insights into the power of collaboration for real action when we want to do the right thing, integration of data and data access, and better reporting and monitoring for supporting better policies to alleviate energy hardship. NECA has done a fair bit of work on this thus far. We've been saying for a while now that the energy transition can either be a key enabler of energy justice and broader social justice here in Australia, or it can also be a catalyst to widen the energy divide and inequality. And the difference between these two futures, it's not accidental. So it really depends on the institutional architecture that we build, the metrics that we choose, and it depends on who is visible in our data and who is not, how Harriet mentioned. So a report produced by my brilliant colleagues, Elham and Ash, based on the analysis of our survey data, highlighted that around 1 in 5 households in Australia are vulnerable to or experiencing energy hardship to some extent. While we had 3 different indicators to try to capture the diversity of experiences, noting the limitations in all of that, we also found that most households were only captured by 1 indicator. And that tells us something important. What we measure shapes what we see, and who we don't see. So metrics are not neutral. They shape attention, they shape funding, they shape regulatory action, and they shape who receive who receive support and who falls through the cracks. So the purpose of the session, as Craig highlighted, is to explore this very simple question. If we measured hardship differently, maybe more multidimensionally, more collaboratively, more intentionally, would our policies look different? Would our transition look different? And I'm really excited to expand on this with Harriet and Travers. So, Travers, you lead the amazing work that Brotherhood of St. Laurence is doing and the national conversation on multidimensional poverty, not just about income, but including living conditions, health, education, social participation. In light of Harriet's keynote, how might a multidimensional poverty lens reshape how we define and measure energy hardship here in Australia?
Great, thanks Carol, and thank you Harriet for that marvellous presentation and incredible body of work over decades, so thank you. It's awesome to have the international experience. Morning everyone, I'm being in McLeod, adding a little bit more of a Scottish connection to this morning, and I think as Craig was saying, had to sprint from Ultimo down here, so I've certainly got here just in time. I'm conscious that the traditional owners will have been acknowledged, but I want to add my acknowledgement of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to Elders past and present and First Nations colleagues and leaders in the room. BSL, for those that don't know about our work, we've got a vision of an Australia free of poverty. Our purpose is to advance a fair Australia through our leadership on policy reform, our partnerships with communities and the quality of our services. And we have about 2,500 staff and volunteers working with partners across the country to build capability and confidence. And we do that from the early years all the way up to supporting older people in the community. And we try to learn alongside and innovate with communities, take those lessons and use them to inform bigger, bolder policy propositions. And I can see someone who in the audience who's led a lot of the work in the past on energy hardship, energy stress at BSL, Damien Sullivan. Just want to acknowledge his work. What Carol's asked me to talk about is our work on multidimensional poverty measurement. And I want to start just with a question for everyone, because Harriet put up the naughty list and the nice list earlier. About 160 countries around the world measure poverty officially and report on poverty measures through their statistical agencies. I want people to put their hands up if you think that Australia is among that group of 160 countries. Okay, put your hands up if you think we're not among that group of 160 countries. It's a very informed audience. It surprises people internationally to learn that a country that led the way about thinking of poverty measurement, the Henderson Inquiry in the 1970s, and what was really the most comprehensive account of the nature and extent of poverty in Australia, led to the Henderson Line, which is now still reported on but outdated, it surprises people to learn that we don't have official poverty measures. And best practice is to have a monetary measure and a multidimensional measure, and Australia has neither. What BSL has been doing over the last 18 months or so is working with the University of Oxford and Professor Sabina Al-Khair, who's the Professor of Poverty and Human Development there, and the Melbourne Institute to develop a demonstration multidimensional poverty index for Australia. And we've been doing that using the HILDA data set, which is the Housing Income Labour Dynamics data set, and we've looked back 20 years. And it's relevant for this work because it's very difficult for us as a country to understand the reasons why people are experiencing deprivation, experiencing disadvantage, experiencing poverty, if we don't understand the reasons why that is the case. And in some of those examples, the reasons will be monetary, but in many other examples, there's an intersectional component. There are cascading deprivations or capabilities that communities and people aren't benefiting from. So the multidimensional poverty index that we've developed has got 5 dimensions: health, education, employment, housing, and social capital. And the indicators for housing draw on the work that BSL has done on energy stress and energy hardship. So those 2 indicators that we used, and building on the HILDA data, were difficulty heating homes and late housing payments. The work that we did on energy stress a few years ago had more indicators that were used to calculate energy stress in Australia. But if we look back 20 years using that demonstration multidimensional poverty index, the 3 biggest drivers of multidimensional poverty across that period, based on the HILDA data, are health, particularly those with long-term health conditions, housing, particularly social housing and those who are renting, and social connection. And that goes to belonging, connection to social support. What's interesting about those findings is the overlapping incidence of those deprivations or multidimensional poverty in those dimensions, but particularly the correlation between BSL's work on energy stress, energy poverty, and what Harriet's been speaking about, and that being quite a consistent and growing driver of multidimensional poverty in Australia. So we've been, pushing and making the case at the national level for Australia to adopt official poverty measures. It's been something that's been supported by the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, and there's been a very warm response, I've got to say, from senior officials and from parliamentarians across the aisle. But getting that right, if it is adopted, will be really important, not just to understanding the nature and extent of poverty in Australia, but also the nature and extent of how energy poverty and stress connect to housing in this country too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Travers. And just to mention as well that apart from all of this work that you're doing on multidimensional poverty and the idea of establishing official metrics, the Commonwealth Government has also developed a national energy equity framework aiming to establish some energy hardship indicators. And I'm pleased to say that Harriet and Lee White have been doing really good conversations with Commonwealth DQ and states and territories on this. Well, when you have the most amazing keynote speaker on your session, when she does a little bit of your job for you. So Harriet, at the end of her presentation, she put forward a few questions, a few provocations that I would really like to revisit here. But before I do, I just want to remind everyone to start adding your questions to Slido, and we'll be going through those shortly as well. But yeah, so let's think about this, Harriet. How different would our indicators on energy justice, or in this case, energy injustice and poverty, be if we asked affected households, and perhaps the extreme cases of households, to tell us what it looks and feels like?
Yeah, that's a tough question to start with. But
you added it.
I think if you talk to people, who are struggling, often it's the things that it impacts on in their lives that they highlight. So, certainly in a European context, when I've talked to families, it's that kind of sense of shame of, if they've got struggling with kind of mold and damp problems at home, they'll start to limit kind of social contact. They won't have people come around to their house. It seems like the things that they've having to cut back in life. So for me, I think that's often a really important place to focus on, is what are those kind of coping strategies. So I think that would be something that will really come out in the work that we do is what actually people need to do, and highlighted some of those already around, cutting back real essentials in life and turning to often quite dangerous practices. We've seen that a lot across Europe, people just using all sorts of different kinds of fuels, burning rubbish, burning household furniture, lots of different things to kind of get by. So I think that would be the one thing it really flags is obviously affordability comes through very loud and clear, but it's more the impact on everyday life and the kind of human capabilities, what it enables people to do or what it kind of limits.
Travers, any perspectives on this?
And I think Harriet's covered it. I mean, one thing that when we did the work on energy stress and it was released in 2022, there were 4 things we looked at, which were sort of driven by the data at the time, and that was the percentage of housing, of the percentage of household expenditure, before and after housing costs, energy bills, cost to household, the ability to heat homes, and late payments. So some of those debt indicators. One thing that we hear a lot in speaking to participants, clients, community members, is not just the shame in being able to make those pernicious and invidious choices, but also broader desires around energy use. So they want it to be healthy. They want it to be, where possible, clean. And they want it to be affordable. They want to be able to power their homes and make sure that they can keep the lights on, so to speak. But there's a broader intersectional set of needs and desires that our participants and clients speak to that go to the intersectional nature of the challenge. And some of the work we've done on financial capability and stress, we've also seen in the work on energy stress, where unfortunately some of the flags that are used to determine whether or not people are in energy stress or hardship simply aren't sufficient to be able to identify those concerns early and for major sort of retailers or companies to respond effectively enough.
Speaking of retailers, we actually have one of the most voted questions in Slido. So how are you working with retailers to raise those poverty flags in their systems? Have retailers been supportive of this?
Oh, mixed bag. Yeah, sometimes it does feel like you have to sort of drag retailers kicking and screaming to to do things often. But no, there have been some retailers who've been really engaged. I think when we make asks of retailers to do things within their own data systems, that's definitely been received, more warmly than encouraging data sharing. That's something that we just have really struggled with. There's a default excuse of privacy laws, GDPR, which we have plenty of workarounds on that. We have examples where that has worked effectively between government sharing their data and retailers using it. But no, I think especially with smart meter data, I think there's certainly quite a few retailers that we've been engaged with who are keen to see if they could do more to kind of develop these flags. And it's sort of it's mutually beneficial that they are kind of engaging proactively at an earlier point. If we can avoid build-up of debt, if we can avoid disconnections, that's just good for everyone, especially at the moment. One thing I didn't really highlight is an aftermath of kind of COVID and the energy crisis has just been record levels of debt. We have so much energy debt right now across Europe, and that's causing a huge amount of problems for the solvency of energy suppliers. And in fact, I say quite often in the UK, we had a really chaotic period during kind of 2022, 2023. We had almost 40 retailers went bankrupt, and it was a very kind of rocky time. So no, I do think that's something, and I know certainly it's been a mixed picture in Australia with the rollout of smart meter data, but I do think there's a lot of potential there to be more proactive and to have that onus placed on retailers to be actively identifying those households. And sure, you have solar rooftop systems, but where they're interconnected. And again, that's just a data linkage problem. So I think sometimes we kind of have these excuses come up about data, but they're not really that complicated. It's just a willingness at the end of the day to kind of work together on that problem. But yeah, we certainly have some who just really refuse to engage as well. So it's not all,
Yeah, I think it's a shared challenge here too. So the latest report from the Australian Energy Regulator on performance data actually shows a an upwards trends in disconnections, and that as well, how that has been increasing for a number of reasons, and how those customers in what we call hardship programs that are receiving some tailored assistance, some form of assistance to deal with their payment difficulty, are not really being identified early enough, right? So, Travers, your work with BSL, have you engaged with retailers on this?
Yeah, we have, and also with regulators too. I know that, ASIC and Sarah Court and others have been really interested in these sorts of issues from a financial system and banking perspective. With retailers, absolutely, and with peak bodies. I just want to kind of hone in though on the, people that are experiencing energy stress. When we did the work Power Pain a few years ago, it was about 18 to 23% of households experienced some form of energy stress over the period 2006 to 2020. But those households in energy stress in 2020, 41% of those were in the lowest 20% of incomes, 35% were renting or in community housing, 27% of those were one member of the household had a long-term health condition or disability, and 43% were on social security payments. I say that because one of the issues that's emerged in the financial system and banking system around flagging hardship and stress is that somebody might present to a branch, but there isn't the data linkage from the branch up to the bigger system for that to be immediately triaged and acted on. In fact, the onus is back on the customer to call a particular line or to report it elsewhere. They're often told to do that, and we see the same thing in the energy system. So changing the onus is really important, and doing the no regrets things around data linkage so that there can be preventative action rather than reactive action. I can see Steph Tonkin here, who would have spoken about some of these things yesterday.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. So should we be redirecting funds currently used to rebate solar and batteries, in many cases quite regressive, without a means test to near zero cost upgrades for those experiencing energy stress and hardship?
So, I think there have been announcements around those rebates already. We would certainly support, and we've been speaking to policymakers and senior officials about greater support for low-income households to enable them to be front and centre of a fairer and faster transition. But we've also been doing some work on where this is just cost effective and leads to greater productivity in the system. So there's some work that we've been doing, which will be released soon and supported by ECA, looking at whether there's a greater return for electrifying households instead of doing business as usual gas upgrades, for example. And in a community of about 800 people, we found an $800 million saving by focusing on electrification rather than BAU kind of gas upgrades. So it's partly around making sure that we're thinking about rebates and support in a really progressive way that lifts all households, but particularly those that have the most to lose through an abrupt transition. But we're thinking really creatively through what the most cost-effective way of doing that as well.
Yeah. One interesting question that we have here. So why should we think about energy poverty differently than income poverty? I think between the both of you, we get a great answer. So.
Probably. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. So in response to the last question, I was just sort of thinking through, schemes that have worked really well. And I'll wind my way to answering that question. So my favourite kind of scheme historically was the Community Energy Savings Programme. So this was set up back under a kind of Labour government before the kind of chaotic period that Robert outlined with our multiple prime ministers, and the kind of competition with a lettuce. So we, with that scheme, it didn't require any means testing. It didn't use passport benefits. It was purely based on the postcode. So it was targeted at the lowest 20% in the indices of multiple deprivation. So we have a nationwide system of that, and that's a multidimensional index. So if you lived in a qualifying postcode, that was enough. And what worked really well, and there's been extensive evaluation of that scheme, what worked really well was it removed the stigma. This was street by street, whole house upgrades. And it really was very simple for people to opt into it. You know, you didn't have to prove your eligibility, and you didn't have to have all of those kind of hurdles that we know prevent people often from getting support. So that was a fantastic scheme. It did a lot, and there were really good bonus structure as well for, this was delivered primarily by retailers. They were incentivized to do multiple measures within a single house. So that was the kind of deliberate structure of it. So really fantastic scheme. I really kind of advise going and looking at that. I think what's important about that is it kind of flags that, you know, within a single street, you have so much diversity. You have people where perhaps they're asset rich. You know, you think of a pensioner who owns their home outright, but they're very income poor with a very low pension. But you might also have someone who's, you know, kind of a young adult. They're kind of transitioning into, they're having children. They might be renting still. We know there's a huge issue with generation rent. Who are facing really high housing costs. So they might look like they're a, you know, middle income earner on paper. They're not in the kind of poverty group. But they've got all these other stressors, and they can't control the upgrades. All of the things we've been hearing about yesterday, they can't install renewables, they can't improve the insulation on the windows. So that's where you start to see those kind of intersectional characteristics really combine. And I think, for me, certainly, I think it would be wrong to kind of really link it explicitly just to income when we know there's so many other drivers. And also, I think the energy crisis has really flagged that nearly all income groups, apart from the super rich, were suddenly exposed and were really struggling. And that's I think, a really interesting case where we just really need to think of it very holistically and make sure we are bringing the energy policy and the social policy together kind of coherently. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
I agree with all of that. I mean, the reason I've described the findings in our demonstration MPI is because if you think about those drivers, health, housing, social connection, they're not going to show up if you just have a measure which is focused on income, a monetary measure. And that's why, you know, best practice internationally now is to do both. So you can have a sort of a 360-degree view, particularly of the intersectional reasons why households and communities are experiencing poverty, which allows you to identify what investment can focus on multiple dimensions at once. And in some cases that will be about income, but in many cases it won't be. It also means you can celebrate progress on reducing those deprivations faster. They might show up faster in some areas. The other reason I think it's really important to focus on multidimensional poverty as well as monetary poverty, and to use a broader suite of indicators in the way that Harriet has described, is because of the broader implications for our economic compact, for our democracy. So I mentioned that social connectedness, social capital, was one of the biggest drivers of multidimensional poverty in our demonstration MPI over the last 2 decades. There was some data out last year by the McKinnon Foundation on Australian democracy, the McKinnon Index, and the sharpest factor in determining whether you trust or distrust our democracy, according to that dashboard, was belonging. You know, people with a low sense of belonging have much deeper distrust of democracy. They're more likely to think that elections and institutions aren't free or fair, and they're more likely to think that it's justifiable to use violence to advance particular causes. If we don't look at the experience of poverty in a multidimensional way, we miss those broader implications for our social and economic compact and for our democracy.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of the session. I do have one question that I would like everyone in the audience to pause and reflect on. So if we fast forward 10 years in time and we find out that the energy transition has actually widened inequality in Australia rather than reduced it, what would we realize that we failed to measure or failed to design early enough in light of what Harriet and Travers mentioned? So thank you very much, Harriet and Travers, for pushing this conversation forward, for being so generous in sharing your wisdom and for the passion with which you carry through your work. Thank you very much, everyone, for the Slido questions, which we didn't really have time to go through all of those. And I think the last thing I would like to say, as we discussed, so metrics are not neutral. they are quite levers of power, and they shape accountability. And if in those 10 years' time, inequality has really widened, it won't be because we lacked the data. I think yesterday's talks and today really show like we have the data. It will be because we chose to prioritize the wrong data, right? So we have this huge challenge ahead to redesign accountability in the energy transition, and we count on all of you to be part of it. So thank you very much.